David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The underlying dispute with Warner Brothers here was always about money. It was always brinksmanship on the part of the various parties that have been involved, trying to maximise their share of the spoils of this commercial endeavour. And we know that those involved in brinkmanship included the union movement. We also know that the union movement pulled out from their brinkmanship earlier than was acknowledged by other sides. We know that as early as the 14th of October, Jerry Brownlee in his press release thought things were reasonably under control. He now denies that they were completely under control. That may or may not be the case, but we know that certainly by the 18th of October, American time, the Americans thought that all of the industrial disputes were behind them. So, Mr Speaker, the brinksmanship that was then left alive was as between two parties that we know of, Warner Brothers and the government, both of whom were trying to get the best deal out of it possible. I certainly accept what Jerry Brownlee says when he says that the national government wanted the Hobbit film in New Zealand, and I agree with him, and I think everyone except people like David Bennett agree that other parties in this Parliament had the same ambition that these films be filmed in New Zealand. In fact, the New Zealand unions, I won't necessarily say that in respect to the Australian unions, but the New Zealand unions, the New Zealand workers, the National Party, the Labour Party, Sir Peter Jackson, they all wanted this movie in New Zealand. Now, how long has it been about money? Well, we've got Sir Peter Jackson recorded in the Dominion on the 15th of December last year saying that New Zealand's film industry was being squeezed by a high dollar, making movies more expensive to shoot, and increased competition from other countries offering better incentives. The 15th of December 2009 is when he said that. He said if that happened, New Zealand could lose out. He said that New Zealand had already lost two major productions to Australia, the third Narnia film and Sea Shepherd about anti-whaling campaigners, again on the 15th of December. And he also said, and again I'm quoting from this news article of the Dominion Post on the 15th of December, he said he thought people thought New Zealand had some magical quality that attracted movies, but it's going to come down to the dollars. So since then, the government and everyone in New Zealand has known that there is a negotiation afoot. We also know from history that that's how Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema operate. We had that experience when we were in government. No one is surprised that they were trying to relitigate the deal to try and maximise their share of the spoils, their share of the profits. We know that we had brinksmanship still alive on the part of Warner Brothers and on the part of the government. What we don't know is whether there are other disputes, and I do actually hope that the Fourth Estate goes and asks questions as to whether there was some other negotiations not involving the unions and Labour that were afoot as between Warner Brothers and other parties to this deal. It's a question which is yet to be answered. It's a question which is yet to be answered. Now, I think that the commentators have got that. We've seen all of the major dailies in New Zealand pick up on this point, and I'll quote an article from earlier this week from Vernon Small in the Herald, where he's saying, in the Dominion, did I say the Herald? I meant the Dominion. Vernon Small in the Dominion saying that what would have happened if Warner Brothers had pulled the plug without an excuse. I'll read this out. Had Warner Brothers pulled the plug without that excuse, and this is the excuse of the union dispute, Sir Peter could have come under attack for abandoning his home country to direct our movie elsewhere. Warner would have looked greedy for asking more to stay or venal for leaving, and the government would have looked weak and compliant if it had failed to return the movie or bent to blackmail. That is what is behind this. The brinksmanship had gone too far. The government was worried that they were going to lose, and so they wanted someone to blame other than themselves. So despite the record being clear that by then the industrial disputes had been settled, despite the record being clear that the Labour Party hasn't been involved at all in these negotiations, John Key stuck it at every opportunity to the union movement and tried to link the Labour Party in with the earlier disputes which by then had been resolved anyway. Mr Speaker, it has been clever politics on the part of the National Party. I acknowledge that they have succeeded in fooling many people in New Zealand that this was caused by an industrial dispute. The reality, it was caused by brinksmanship. The brinksmanship worked. Warner Brothers got an extra $34 million of taxpayer money, which increases the profitability to them of this movie by that amount. Mr. Speaker, why were the government motivated to do this? Well, of course, they are at risk. They already know it in respect of their failed economic development plans. We've heard this previously. I'll list them again. Close the wage gap with Australia. They've been shown to be failing in that ambition. What's their economic development plan been made up so far of? A cycleway, that's not got many jobs. A financial services hub plan, that's gone by the wayside. Mining and national parks was going to be how we close that wage gap. That's gone. And then they faced the risk of losing these movies. And so they needed someone else to blame, despite the fact that it's absolutely clear from what I've read out in respect of the 15 December 2009 article in the Dominion Post that it was money behind this. They didn't get onto it earlier. They let this go down to the wire. Actually, not totally within their control, I have to admit, in the interests of Warner Brothers to let this go to the wire, because the closer they were to leaving, the stronger their negotiating position was with the government, and therefore they could screw some extra $34 million worth of concessions out of the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is completely unnecessary. There is already the ability to contract with workers in the film industry as independent contractors rather than employees. That is already permissible under this law. You just have to do it properly. It has been done properly in all these films since that decision of the Supreme Court 5 years ago, including Avatar. Including Avatar, that award-winning enormous blockbuster, large parts of which were made in New Zealand by Weta Workshops and others. Mr. Speaker,
and discussed with James Cameron in Los Angeles years before when we were trying to retain it.
Thank you, Mr. Mallard, for that. Mr. Speaker, Avatar shows that this was not a necessary change to the law. You only have to contract properly. These are multi-million-dollar enterprises, multi-hundred-million-dollar enterprises. They can afford and do purchase the best of lawyers, the best of legal advice. Weta Workshops is a multi-million-dollar organisation. They purchase the best of contractors and the best of advice. And I bet that after they lost that Supreme Court case, they got their contracts right subsequently. Mr. Speaker, there was no need for this change of law. This change of law, I don't think, was even central to what Warner Brothers wanted. What was central to what Warner Brothers wanted was more money. They got their $34 million. This was convenient. This was convenient for the National Party because it enabled them to stick it to the unions, and it enabled them to try and link Labour with the earlier actions of some of those Australian unionists. And actually, you know, we haven't in this House been defending what those Australian unionists did when it came to trying to call for a worldwide boycott. You have not heard one Labour Party person defend that, because we don't defend it. But what we won't put up with is the misrepresentation that has occurred here, that long after the Labour dispute was settled, that was the reason for what's going down here. It is not. What was going down was a shakedown by Warner Brothers of an extra $34 million of taxpayers' money. And what was going down from the National Party was that they wanted someone else to blame and to stick it to the unions and to stick it to Labour. Mr. Speaker, no one is fooled by that. We are pleased that The Hobbit is being filmed in New Zealand and that other films will continue to be filmed in New Zealand, but what drives them is the creativity of the New Zealand film industry and the competitiveness of the financial rewards of those who back those films.
Well done.